Sometimes we think we know our loved ones, but what happens when secrets and betrayal turn everything upside down? This story will show you just how fragile trust can be and how hard it is to rebuild love after it's been broken. Watch until the end to find out if this family can find their way to forgiveness and healing, or if their relationships will be lost forever. The answer will shock you. I pulled into the driveway after another grueling 12-hour shift at the clinic. My truck groaned as I turned off the ignition, and for a moment, I just sat there, staring at the soft glow of the porch light. The scent of fresh-cut grass mixed with the crisp evening air, but all I felt was exhaustion. Walking into the house, I was greeted by the familiar scent of lavender and cookies. Emily always had a way of making the house feel like a warm, inviting sanctuary. She was in the kitchen, her blonde hair pulled back into a loose bun, humming softly. I leaned against the doorway, watching her set the table with her usual grace. "Hey, honey, I'm home," I called out, smiling despite my fatigue. She turned and flashed me a bright smile. "Welcome back. Dinner's almost ready." Her cheerfulness seemed genuine, but there was something off. A shadow in her eyes, maybe. I told myself I was imagining it. The stress of work was probably making me overthink. "How was your day?" I asked as I settled at the table. "Oh, the usual," she said, brushing it off. "I helped Mark with some paperwork earlier." I stiffened slightly at the mention of my brother. Mark had moved into the house next door after his messy divorce, and while I was glad to have him close, I couldn't ignore how often Emily mentioned him lately. Still, I shrugged it off. They were just being friendly. As I ate, Emily seemed distant, her gaze flitting to the window more than once. I wanted to ask what was on her mind, but instead, I let the silence hang between us. She'd tell me if something was wrong. At least, that's what I told myself. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside her, I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. I turned to watch her sleep, her face soft and peaceful. I wanted to believe everything was fine, that the woman I loved more than anything wouldn't keep secrets from me. But deep down, something told me the cracks in our life were starting to show, and I had no idea just how deep they went. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the house still wrapped in silence. Emily was curled up on her side, her blonde hair fanned across the pillow. She looked so peaceful, so perfect, that I almost felt guilty for the knot of doubt twisting in my chest. Almost. I kissed her forehead softly before heading to the bathroom to start my day. As the water ran, I stared at my reflection in the mirror, the bags under my eyes telling the story of too many late nights at the clinic and too little rest. The thought hit me again. Was it just the stress of work making me feel this way? Or was there something deeper I wasn't ready to face? At the clinic, I tried to lose myself in the routine, treating sprained paws, deworming kittens, comforting anxious owners. But the nagging thought of Emily kept pulling me out of focus. Her distance, her glances out the window, the way she mentioned Mark so casually, as if it didn't mean anything. By lunch, I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up my phone and called her. It rang a few times longer than usual before she answered. "Hey, babe," she said, her voice light but slightly breathless. "Hi," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Just checking in. Everything okay?" "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" she asked quickly, her tone almost defensive. "No reason. I just wanted to hear your voice." There was a pause on the other end, the faint sound of her breathing filling the silence. "You're sweet," she said finally. "I'm actually heading out soon. Groceries and stuff. I'll see you tonight." "Yeah. Love you." "Love you too," she said, but the words felt muted, distant. After the call, I stared at the phone in my hand, my chest tight. Her tone, her hesitation, it didn't sit right with me. I shook my head, telling myself I was overthinking again. Emily loved me. She always had. That was all that mattered, wasn't it? The rest of the day dragged, and by the time I got home, the house was quiet again. Emily was in the living room, her legs tucked beneath her as she read a book. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're home early," she said, setting the book aside. "Yeah, had a cancellation," I replied, sitting down beside her. "How was your day?" "Same as always," she said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. Her perfume wafted over me, familiar and comforting. But then I caught a faint, foreign scent beneath it. A hint of cologne, one that wasn't mine. "Did Mark stop by?" I asked, keeping my tone even. She froze for half a second before laughing lightly. "No, why? Just smelled cologne, that's all." "Oh, that," she said quickly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I ran into him at the store earlier. We talked for a bit." I nodded, forcing myself to smile. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her explanation made sense, of course it did. Yet the unease in my chest only grew. That night, as she slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to ask and answers I wasn't ready to hear. Was I losing my mind? Or was there something Emily wasn't telling me? Deep down, I already knew, but I wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. The days stretched on, and I tried to push the doubts aside. Work was relentless, which helped dull the constant gnawing in my chest, but it didn't erase it. Emily seemed normal, too normal. She carried on with her usual routines, humming softly as she cleaned or cooked, but there was something off about the way she avoided my gaze when I asked about her day. I noticed every detail now. The way her answers came a little too quickly, the slight edge in her voice when I mentioned Mark. I told myself I was being paranoid. Mark was my brother, for God's sake. Sure, he'd been through a tough divorce and moved in next door, but he was family. Emily had always been kind to him, helping him settle in and checking on him when I couldn't. There was nothing wrong with that, was there? One evening, I came home earlier than usual. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost unnatural. Emily wasn't in the kitchen or the living room. I called out her name, but there was no answer. That's when I noticed the faint sound of laughter coming from the backyard. I stepped outside and froze. Emily and Mark were sitting on the patio, their heads close together, laughing about something I couldn't hear. Mark leaned back, his arm draped casually over the chair next to hers. They looked so at ease, so familiar. They noticed me almost immediately. Emily straightened up, her smile faltering as her eyes met mine. Mark gave me a sheepish grin, scratching the back of his neck. "Hey bro," he said. "Didn't expect you back so early." "Clearly," I replied, my voice colder than I intended. Emily stood quickly, brushing invisible crumbs off her dress. "Mark stopped by to borrow a book," she said, her tone overly bright. "We were just catching up." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My pulse thundered in my ears as I looked between them. The rational part of me screamed that this was nothing, that I was reading into something innocent. But the way Emily fidgeted with her hands, the way Mark avoided my gaze, it all felt wrong. I forced a smile, pretending I didn't notice the tension in the air. "Don't let me interrupt," I said, turning back toward the house. "I'll just get out of your way." Inside, I stood at the kitchen sink, gripping the edge of the counter. My reflection in the window stared back at me, eyes dark with exhaustion, and something else, something I didn't want to name. A few minutes later, Emily came in, her footsteps tentative. "James," she said softly, "are you okay?" I turned to her, searching her face for some sign of the woman I thought I knew. "Yeah, long day, that's all." Her brow furrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might press the issue. But she just nodded, giving me a small smile before retreating upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen for a long time, the weight of doubt pressing down on me. Every instinct told me something wasn't right, but I didn't want to believe it. Not yet. Not until I had proof. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Emily's laughter with Mark echoed in my mind, looping endlessly like a bad song. Her reassurances, her quick smiles, they weren't enough anymore. I needed answers. The next day, I left work earlier than usual. I told myself it was to surprise Emily, to take her out for dinner and talk, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the full truth. I needed to see for myself what was going on, to confirm or disprove the suspicions that had taken root in my chest. As I pulled into the driveway, my heart sank. Mark's car was parked out front. Again, I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, willing myself to calm down. There was nothing unusual about this, I told myself. They were family. Maybe he needed something, Or maybe Emily was just being her usual helpful self. I walked up to the house, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the porch. The door was unlocked as always. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of lavender greeting me, but the house was quiet, eerily quiet. Too quiet. "Emily," I called out, my voice steady, even as my pulse quickened. There was no answer. My chest tightened. I made my way down the hallway toward our bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of light to spill into the hall. My footsteps felt heavy, like I was walking underwater. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open. And there they were, Emily and Mark, tangled in the sheets, oblivious to my presence. The image burned itself into my mind, her golden hair spilling over the pillow, his arm draped across her waist. My breath hitched, but I couldn't make a sound. I couldn't move. The world seemed to tilt, the edges of my vision blurring. Emily was the first to notice me. Her eyes widened in horror, and she scrambled to pull the sheets around her. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't what it looks like." Mark sat up, his face pale. "James," he started, but I cut him off with a raised hand. "Don't," I said, my voice low and sharp. "Don't say a word." The silence that followed was deafening. My heart pounded in my ears, each beat echoing with a mixture of fury and devastation. I wanted to scream, to hit something, to demand an explanation that could never make this okay. But instead, I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't slam the door. I didn't yell. I just walked out of the house and into the crisp evening air, my mind a chaotic storm. The people I loved most in the world had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and I had no idea what to do next. Standing on the porch, I stared at the horizon, the colors of the setting sun blurring together as tears filled my eyes. The life I thought I had was gone, shattered in an instant, and all I could do was stand there, trying to breathe through the weight of it all. I don't know how long I stood on the porch. Time felt meaningless, blurred by the storm raging inside me. My world, my marriage, my trust, it had all been destroyed. And by who? My wife and my brother, two people I had loved more than anything. The door creaked open behind me, but I didn't turn around. I heard the soft shuffle of Emily's bare feet on the porch. For a moment, I thought she might say nothing, just stand there like I was. Instead, her voice came, trembling and small. "James, please let me explain." I laughed bitterly, a sound that felt foreign in my throat. "Explain? What exactly are you going to explain, Emily? That I just imagined what I saw? That this wasn't what it so clearly was?" She stepped closer, but I didn't look at her. "I couldn't. It wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered. "I never meant to hurt you." "Never meant to hurt me?" I repeated, finally turning to face her. My voice rose, sharp and bitter. "You didn't mean to hurt me, but you slept with my brother? In my house? In our bed?" Her face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice cracking. I don't even know how it started. I was lonely, James. You were always working, always gone. And that justifies this?" I cut her off, the anger boiling over. "We both wanted this life, Emily. We agreed on it, working hard now so we could build something better. And this is how you repay me." She shook her head violently, stepping closer. "No, James. I love you. I do. This was stupid. It didn't mean anything." I laughed again, hollow and bitter. "Didn't mean anything? You risked everything we've built, everything we are, for something that didn't mean anything." Behind her, I saw Mark step out of the house. He looked pale, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The sight of him made my blood boil. "Don't," I said sharply, my eyes locking on his. "Don't even think about saying a word." "James," Mark started, his voice low, almost pleading. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." "Stop," I snapped, my voice cutting through the night. "You don't get to apologize, Mark. You don't get to stand there and act like this was some accident. You made a choice. Both of you did." He flinched, his gaze dropping to the ground. Emily reached for me, but I stepped back, holding up a hand to stop her. "I can't do this right now," I said, my voice quieter now, but no less firm. "Emily, pack a bag and leave." Mark, get out of my sight. I don't care where you go, but I don't want to see you. Either of you. James, please. Emily begged, her voice breaking. We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes. Just please don't give up on us. I looked at her, my chest tightening with a mix of love, pain, and anger. You already gave up on us, Emily. Without another word, I turned and walked down the steps, leaving them both standing there. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there, in the place that had once been my sanctuary, but now felt like a graveyard of broken trust. I drove aimlessly for hours, the roads winding through the quiet countryside under a blanket of stars. The air was cool, and the windows of my truck were down, but it did nothing to soothe the fire burning in my chest. My thoughts circled endlessly. Emily's tear-streaked face, Mark's stammered apologies, the image of them together in our bed. Every time I closed my eyes, it was there, like a scar I couldn't stop tracing. When I finally pulled back into the driveway, the house was dark and still. I hoped they had both left. I couldn't face either of them again. Not yet. Stepping inside, the quiet of the house was deafening. The scent of lavender lingered, but it felt hollow now, a ghost of the life I thought we had. Emily's suitcase was gone. The bedroom looked the same as I'd left it, except for her side of the closet, now emptier than it had been that morning. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the space where her things had been, trying to wrap my head around how quickly everything had fallen apart. In the kitchen, I found a note on the counter, written in her delicate handwriting. James, I'm so sorry. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back, but I still love you. I'll be staying at my mom's for now. Please, when you're ready, let's talk. Emily. I crumpled the note in my hand, anger and sadness swirling inside me. Talk? About what? What could she possibly say that would make this better? For the next few days, I threw myself into work, leaving before sunrise and returning long after dark. The clinic became my refuge, a place where I could focus on something other than the wreckage of my personal life. The animals didn't ask questions or betray trust. They needed me, and I needed the distraction. But even at work, the weight of it followed me. My coworkers noticed my exhaustion, the way I barely spoke during lunch breaks or lingered too long in my office after hours. You okay, James? One of the techs asked me. I lied and said I was fine, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. When I returned home late one evening, the quiet was suffocating. I sat in the dark living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at the framed photo of Emily and me from our honeymoon. We looked so happy, so full of hope. I wondered if she'd felt this way even then, if there had been cracks in our relationship that I'd been too blind to see. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Mark. Mark, I know you don't want to hear from me, but I can't just leave things like this. I need to talk to you. Please give me a chance to explain. I stared at the message for a long time, my finger hovering over the delete button. Part of me wanted to ignore him, to cut him out of my life completely, but another part of me needed answers. I couldn't move forward without knowing why. I texted back a single word, fine. A few hours later, Mark showed up at the house, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He stood on the porch, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes avoiding mine. Come in, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. If he was surprised, he didn't show it. He stepped inside, but I didn't offer him a seat. Well, I said, crossing my arms. Talk. Mark looked at me, his face pale. James, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean much, but I am. I never wanted to hurt you. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You never wanted to hurt me? You slept with my wife, Mark. Don't stand there and act like this was some accident. It wasn't, he admitted, his voice breaking. I made a mistake. A terrible, selfish mistake. I was lonely, and Emily, she was there. That's your excuse? I snapped, my anger boiling over. You were lonely? So you thought what? Sleeping with your brother's wife was the solution? He flinched at my words, his shoulders sagging. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I needed you to know how much I regret it. I'll leave if that's what you want. For a moment, I just stared at him, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Mark had been my brother, my confidant, my friend. And now he was a stranger. Leave, I said finally, my voice cold. I don't want to see you again. Mark nodded, his face etched with guilt, and walked out the door without another word. As it clicked shut behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The silence that followed was deafening, but at least now, I was truly alone. The silence was unbearable. The house, once so full of life and warmth, now felt hollow, every corner echoing with memories I couldn't escape. Emily's laughter rang in my ears when I least expected it, and the scent of lavender that lingered in the air seemed almost mocking. I busied myself with work, taking on extra shifts at the clinic, staying late, and volunteering for the cases no one else wanted. Anything to avoid coming home to the emptiness. It worked for the most part. During the day, I could drown myself in routine, in the comfort of knowing I was helping others. But at night, when the world was quiet, the ache in my chest was impossible to ignore. Emily texted me often. Each message was a plea, an apology, or a desperate attempt to reconnect. I read them all, but never responded. What could I say? The betrayal was too fresh, the wound too deep. Then, one evening, I came home to find a note slipped under the door. The sight of her handwriting made my stomach churn. James, I know you're hurting, and I hate myself for being the cause of it. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I can't give up on us. I'm not giving up on you. Please, when you're ready, let me explain everything. I love you. Emily. I crumpled the note in my fist, my jaw tightening. Love? Was that what she called this? Love wasn't supposed to hurt like this. It wasn't supposed to leave you questioning every moment, every word, every promise. I sat on the porch with a beer in hand, staring out at the dark yard. The wind rustled the leaves, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. It was a peaceful night, but inside, I was anything but. I thought about Emily's words, her constant apologies. Part of me wanted to believe her, to let her explain, to give her the chance to make things right. But another part of me, the part that remembered walking into that bedroom, seeing her and Mark together, wanted to shut her out forever. And then there was Mark, my own brother. His guilt was evident in every word he'd said, but it didn't change the fact that he'd shattered my trust. The bond we'd shared felt irreparably broken, and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to look at him the same way again. The worst part was that, deep down, I still loved them both. I hated them for what they'd done, but I couldn't erase years of love and connection in an instant. That was the cruelest part of betrayal. It left you torn between love and anger, between wanting to heal and wanting to walk away. I stayed on the porch until the beer went warm in my hand and the stars faded into the early morning light. When I finally went inside, I felt no closer to an answer than I had the day before. What do you do when the people you love the most are the ones who break you? I didn't know. Not yet. But I was starting to realize that the road ahead wasn't going to be an easy one. The days that followed felt like I was moving through molasses, every step weighed down by memories I couldn't escape. Each corner of the house held a story. Emily laughing in the kitchen as I teased her about burning toast, Mark helping me paint the living room on a lazy Sunday. Those memories, once warm and comforting, now felt like landmines waiting to explode. I avoided the bedroom as much as possible. Sleeping on the couch wasn't exactly comfortable, but it was better than facing the ghost of what had happened there. I tried to busy myself with work, but even at the clinic my mind drifted. The animals couldn't offer the solace they once did. Even their soft eyes seemed to reflect the turmoil inside me. Emily's texts kept coming. Each one chipped away at the wall I'd tried to build around myself. James, I don't know how to live without you. Please, just talk to me. I know I broke your trust, but I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm sorry. Do you still love me? Even a little? That last one hit me harder than I wanted to admit. Did I still love her? Of course I did. Love doesn't vanish overnight, no matter how deep the betrayal. But that love was tangled with anger, hurt, and confusion. How could I reconcile those feelings? One evening, after yet another long day at the clinic, I came home to find a small box on the porch. Emily's name wasn't on it, but I knew it was from her. I hesitated before picking it up, my pulse quickening. Inside was a photo of us from our wedding day, her arms wrapped around me, both of us grinning like we had the world at our feet. Tucked beside it was a letter. I unfolded it slowly, my hands trembling. James, this was one of the happiest days of my life. I know it's hard to believe now, but I still feel the same way about you. I made a mistake, a terrible, selfish mistake, but it doesn't erase the love I have for you. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you. Please don't throw away what we built. Please don't throw away us. Emily. I stared at the photo for a long time, my chest tightening. She looked so happy, so full of life. We both did. That day had been perfect, and for a moment, I let myself remember it. The vows we'd written, the way she'd looked walking down the aisle, the way I'd felt like the luckiest man alive. But then the memory shifted, replaced by the image of her and Mark in our bed. The ache in my chest sharpened, and I shoved the photo and let her back into the box, setting it aside. I couldn't let myself get swept up in nostalgia. The woman in that photo wasn't the woman who had betrayed me. Or maybe she was, and I just hadn't seen it then. Either way, I wasn't ready to let her back in. Not yet. Days turned into weeks, and life continued in a strange, fractured way. I moved through the motions. Waking up, going to work, returning to an empty house, but it felt like I was living someone else's life. The James who had existed before all this, the man who believed in his wife and trusted his brother, felt like a stranger now. Emily's text slowed, but never stopped. She gave me space, but her presence lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. Every now and then, I'd catch myself staring at my phone, wondering if I should respond, if talking to her would somehow help. But the thought of hearing her voice again, of confronting the pain head-on, was too much. One Friday evening, I got home from work to find the box Emily had left still sitting on the kitchen counter, where I'd shoved it days ago. I hadn't opened it again, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away either. It was like a piece of her that I couldn't completely let go of, no matter how much I wanted to. That night, as I sat on the couch with the TV playing in the background, my phone buzzed. I glanced at it, expecting another message from Emily, but instead, it was Mark. Mark, I know I said I'd stay away, but I need to talk to you. Just once. Please. I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. A part of me wanted to block his number, to shut him out entirely. But another part of me, the part that still remembered him as my brother, my best friend, wanted answers. Why had he done it? What had led him to cross a line I thought he never would? After a moment, I typed back a single word, tomorrow. The next morning, Mark showed up at the house. I let him in, though I kept my arms crossed and my expression hard. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days. Guilt clung to him like a second skin. Thanks for seeing me, he said, his voice low. Get to the point. I replied, my tone cold. Why are you here? He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darting around the room before finally landing on me. I wanted to tell you the truth, he said. About everything. I already know the truth, Mark. I snapped. You slept with my wife. What else is there to say? There's more to it than that, he said, his voice trembling. Not excuses, just reasons. I leaned back against the wall, crossing my arms tighter. Then explain. I'm listening. Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping. It wasn't planned, James. I swear to you. It started small, just talking, you know. After the divorce, I was a wreck, and Emily, she was kind. She listened when I felt like no one else cared. I clenched my jaw, the words cutting deeper than I expected. And that led to sleeping with her? No, he said quickly, shaking his head. Not at first, but over time, things got blurry. I don't know how to explain it. I wasn't thinking straight, and neither was she. I stared at him, my chest tight. His words sounded sincere, but they didn't make the betrayal any easier to swallow. And now? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Do you regret it? Or are you just sorry you got caught? Mark's face crumpled, and for a moment, he looked like the brother I used to know. I regret it every single day, he said. Not because I got caught, but because I hurt you. You're my brother, James, and I destroyed that. For the first time, I saw the pain in his eyes, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it made me pause. Maybe he wasn't the monster I'd made him out to be in my head. Maybe he was just as broken as I was. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. But I can't deal with this right now. I need time. Mark nodded, his eyes filled with remorse. I understand, he said. I'll stay away. But if you ever want to talk, I'll be here. As he left, I stood at the window, watching him walk back to his car. The weight in my chest didn't lift, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like I could breathe again. Maybe it wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was a step. The house was quiet again after Mark left, but it felt different this time. The suffocating weight of his presence was gone, replaced by a strange, hollow stillness. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, his words replaying in my mind. I regret it every single day. I didn't know if I believed him. Regret was easy to say, harder to feel, and impossible to measure. But as much as I wanted to hold on to my anger, part of me saw the pain in his eyes, the cracks in his voice. He was hurting too, maybe not as much as me, but enough to remind me that we were both human. Flawed, broken, but human. Later that night, as I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, I thought about Emily, about the way she used to light up a room with her laugh, the way she'd always been the first to say, "We'll get through this," whenever life threw us a curveball. I missed her. I hated that I missed her, but I did. I picked up my phone, scrolling through the texts she'd sent over the past few weeks. Her words blurred together, a mix of apologies and pleas, until I landed on one from just a few days ago. Do you still love me? Even a little? I closed my eyes, the question twisting in my chest. The answer was complicated. Yes, I loved her. How could I not? She was my wife, my partner, the person I'd vowed to spend the rest of my life with. But that love was tangled in so much pain now, so much anger, that I didn't know if it was enough to bridge the gap between us. The next morning, I decided to visit the park where Emily and I used to spend lazy Sunday afternoons. It was quiet, the early morning mist clinging to the grass. I sat on a bench overlooking the small pond, the memories of us feeding ducks and laughing at the absurdity of it all flashing through my mind. I needed clarity, answers, something to help me figure out what came next. And there was only one person who could give me that. I pulled out my phone and typed a short message to Emily. Meet me at the park tomorrow at noon. We need to talk. Her reply came almost immediately. I'll be there. Thank you. I put my phone away, my hands trembling. I didn't know what I was going to say to her, or even what I wanted to hear. But I knew I couldn't keep running from this forever. If there was any chance of moving forward, together or apart, it started with facing the truth. The next day couldn't come fast enough. The next day arrived like a weight pressing on my chest. I barely slept, tossing and turning on the couch as I ran through every possible scenario in my head. What would she say? What could I say? Would this be the beginning of something new or the final nail in the coffin? I arrived at the park early, sitting on the same bench we used to share. The pond was still, the air crisp with the scent of autumn leaves. This place had once been a sanctuary for us, filled with laughter and quiet moments of peace. Now it felt foreign, almost hostile. Emily arrived right on time. She looked different, and yet the same. Her hair pulled back into a simple ponytail, her face bare of makeup. Her eyes were red-rimmed, like she hadn't slept much either. She stopped a few feet away, hesitating, as if waiting for permission to approach. I nodded toward the bench, and she sat down beside me, leaving a noticeable space between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and awkward, until finally she broke it. "Thank you for meeting me," she said softly, her voice trembling. I nodded, but didn't look at her. I figured we couldn't keep avoiding this forever. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, twisting a tissue between her fingers. "I don't know where to start," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "How about the truth?" I said, turning to look at her for the first time. "All of it." She nodded, taking a shaky breath. Her voice cracked, and she had to pause to compose herself. "I don't have an excuse, James. I don't. What I did was selfish and cruel, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." I didn't respond, waiting for her to continue. "I never stopped loving you," she said, her voice stronger now. Not for a second, but somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I felt invisible. You were always working, and I understood why. I did. But the days started to feel so long, so empty. So you turned to Mark, I said, the bitterness in my voice sharper than I intended. She flinched but didn't deny it. It started as just talking. He was going through so much after his divorce, and I wanted to help. But somewhere along the way, it crossed a line. I don't even know how it happened, but it did, and I hate myself for it. I stared at the pond, her words sinking in. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell her how unfair it was to blame her loneliness on me, to remind her that I'd been working to build a life for us, for our future. But another part of me couldn't deny that maybe I had neglected her in ways I hadn't realized. Why didn't you talk to me? I asked finally, my voice quieter now. Why didn't you tell me how you were feeling? I tried, she said, her voice breaking. But every time, it felt like you were so focused on work, on the future, that there wasn't room for the present. And that's not your fault, James. It's mine. I should have been stronger. I should have fought harder for us instead of running to someone else. I closed my eyes, her words slicing through me. I wanted to believe her, to believe that she was truly sorry. But the pain of her betrayal was still too fresh. I don't know if I can forgive you, I admitted, my voice heavy with emotion. I don't even know where to start. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I still love you, James. That I'm still the woman you fell in love with. We sat in silence again, the weight of her words hanging between us. I didn't have an answer. Not for her, not for myself. All I knew was that this conversation was only the beginning of a long and painful journey, one I wasn't sure I was ready to take. The silence between us stretched on, punctuated only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I stared out at the pond, trying to process everything Emily had just said. Her words felt raw, heavy with regret, but they didn't erase what she had done. They didn't make it hurt less. I don't know if I can trust you again, I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. Trust isn't something you can just rebuild overnight. And I'm not sure if I want to. Emily nodded, wiping at her tears with the tissue she'd been clutching. I know. I don't expect you to trust me right now. Maybe not ever. But I want to try, James. If there's even the smallest chance for us, I want to fight for it. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of the woman I'd married. The determination, the fire that had drawn me to her in the first place. But that flicker was buried under layers of guilt and pain, just like the man I used to be was buried under my own anger and hurt. I'm not making any promises, I said, turning to face her. I can't just forgive you and pretend like this didn't happen. It's not that simple. I know, she said, her voice steady now. I don't want you to pretend. I just want a chance to prove that I'm still the person who loves you. That what we had wasn't a lie. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Part of me wanted to tell her it was too late, that no amount of apologies could fix the damage she and Mark had done. But another part of me, a quieter, more conflicted part, wondered if it was worth at least trying. If I owed it to the years we'd spent together, to the love we'd once shared, to see if there was anything left to salvage. I need time, I said finally. Time to think, time to figure out what I want. You need to give me that. She nodded quickly, her expression a mixture of relief and sorrow. Take all the time you need. I'll wait. I'll be here, no matter what. The vulnerability in her voice tugged at something deep inside me, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't let myself be swayed by emotion, not yet. This wasn't something I could rush into. Too much was at stake. My heart, my pride, my sense of who I was. We sat there for a while longer, neither of us speaking. Eventually, Emily stood, her movements hesitant. I should go, she said, her voice soft. Thank you for listening. I nodded, unable to say anything else. She walked away slowly, her figure disappearing down the path, leaving me alone on the bench. As I sat there, the autumn breeze brushing against my face, I realized I still didn't have an answer. I didn't know if I could forgive her, if I could ever trust her again. But for the first time, I felt like I had taken a step forward, even if it was a small one. Whether that step would lead us back together or push us further apart, I still didn't know. But at least I had begun to move. The days after my conversation with Emily were a strange mix of clarity and confusion. I felt lighter, as if saying the words aloud had loosened some of the weight I'd been carrying. But the uncertainty still lingered. Every morning, I woke up to an empty house, and every night, I sat in the silence, replaying her words in my head. I'd given myself permission to take time, but time didn't seem to make anything clearer. The love I'd had for Emily wasn't something I could turn off, no matter how much I wanted to. And the anger, the betrayal, they didn't fade either. Instead, they coexisted in an uneasy truce, leaving me stuck between the man who wanted to forgive and the man who couldn't. Mark stayed away, true to his word. His absence was a relief, but it also left me grappling with questions I couldn't ask him. I wondered if he'd found solace in his guilt, if he was hurting as much as I was. Part of me didn't care, but another part, the part that still saw him as my brother, wanted answers. I hated myself for even considering it, but the thought of confronting him again lingered in the back of my mind. Emily texted me once, a short message that read, "I'm here if you ever want to talk." I didn't reply, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know what to say. How could I express everything I was feeling in a few words? It felt impossible. One evening, I decided to tackle the one place I'd been avoiding, our bedroom. I'd been sleeping on the couch for weeks, but the ache in my back was starting to outweigh the emotional pain of stepping into that room. When I opened the door, the smell of her perfume hit me like a wave. It was faint, but it was there, clinging to the air like a ghost of her presence. The bed was made, the sheets freshly washed, but all I could see was the image of her and Mark tangled together. My fists clenched involuntarily, the anger rising to the surface again. I forced myself to sit on the edge of the bed, taking deep, measured breaths. The room was just a room, I told myself. It didn't hold power over me. Not unless I let it. I sat there for a long time, staring at the floor, willing myself to take back control. That night, I slept in the bed for the first time since it happened. The sleep was restless, filled with fragmented dreams, but it was a step. And in the morning, I felt a little stronger for having taken it. Still, the questions remained. Could I ever forgive Emily? Could I let go of the pain and rebuild something new with her? Or was it better to walk away and start over, leaving the past behind? I didn't know the answers, but I knew I couldn't avoid them forever. The path forward was uncertain, but I was beginning to understand that healing, whatever that looked like, had to start with me. A week passed, then two. Each day, I felt a little less like the shattered man who had stood on that porch watching his life unravel. But the anger and sadness lingered, lurking beneath the surface, ready to consume me the moment I let my guard down. I still hadn't spoken to Emily again. Her one message remained unanswered, and part of me felt guilty for it. She was waiting, giving me the space I'd asked for, but I knew she was hurting too. Despite everything, I didn't take any joy in her pain. If anything, it made my own worse. I'd loved her once. Hell, I still loved her. But the thought of facing her again felt like stepping onto a battlefield I wasn't ready for. It wasn't until a Saturday afternoon, while sorting through some old boxes in the attic, that I stumbled upon a relic of simpler times. Our wedding album. Dusty and tucked away, it sat like a forgotten piece of the life we'd built. My first instinct was to put it back, to shove it into the shadows and pretend I hadn't seen it. But curiosity, or maybe masochism, got the better of me. I flipped through the pages slowly, each photograph a painful reminder of what we used to be. Emily's radiant smile, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the way she looked at me like I was the only man in the world. And then there was Mark standing beside me as my best man, grinning with pride and joy. The weight of it all hit me like a freight train. How had it come to this? How had two people I loved and trusted so deeply become the source of my greatest pain? I felt anger rising again, but this time it wasn't as sharp. It was dull, tired like a fire running out of fuel. I closed the album and sat back, staring at the rafters. If I wanted answers, I knew I couldn't keep running from the ghosts of what had happened. I needed to confront them. Not just Emily, but Mark too. Avoiding them wouldn't heal the wound. It would only let it fester. That evening, I sent 2 texts, one to Emily and one to Mark. Both were short, to the point. To Emily, I want to talk. Tomorrow at noon. Same place. To Mark, we need to clear the air. Can you meet me next week? Emily responded almost instantly. Emily, I'll be there. Thank you, James. Mark's response came later, but it was just as simple. Mark, I'll come by. Just say when. As I set my phone down, a strange sense of calm washed over me. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face them, to hear whatever they had to say. But I knew I couldn't keep running from it. The only way forward was through. Tomorrow would be the first step. The next day, I arrived at the park just before noon. The air was crisp, the leaves swirling in the wind, and the pond reflected the gray sky above. I sat on the same bench as before, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, trying to steady my thoughts. Emily arrived a few minutes later. She looked nervous, her steps tentative as she approached me. She was bundled in a coat, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, and her face was etched with the kind of weariness that mirrored my own. She stopped a few feet away, waiting for some signal from me. Sit, I said quietly, nodding to the bench beside me. She did, leaving a gap between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Thank you for meeting me, she said finally, her voice soft but sincere. I nodded, staring at the pond. I needed to understand, I said. To hear the truth. All of it. No excuses. No deflections. Just the truth. She exhaled shakily, her hands twisting together. You deserve that, she said. I've been replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out how I let it get so far. And the truth is, I don't have an excuse, James. I made a terrible choice. I betrayed you. And I betrayed everything we built together. Her voice cracked, and she paused, gathering herself. I was lonely, and I let myself get swept up in something I didn't fully understand. Mark was there, and he listened when I felt like I couldn't reach you. But I didn't talk to you. I didn't try hard enough to tell you how I felt. And that's on me. All of it. I turned to her, meeting her eyes for the first time. They were brimming with tears, but they didn't look away. Do you regret it? I asked, my voice steady but sharp. Not just getting caught, but everything? She nodded fiercely. Every second of it. I regret it more than I can ever put into words. If I could take it back, I would, but I can't. All I can do is tell you how sorry I am and promise you that it'll never happen again. Her honesty cut through me, leaving me raw. Part of me wanted to lash out, to make her feel the pain she'd caused me. But another part of me, the part that still loved her despite everything, wanted to believe her. To believe that people could change, that wounds could heal. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said finally, my voice quieter now. Or if I even want to. But I also can't deny that I still care about you, Emily. That I still love you. And that's what makes this so damn hard. She let out a soft sob, covering her mouth with her hand. I love you too, James. More than anything. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you if you let me. We sat there for a long time, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between us. I didn't have all the answers, and I wasn't sure if I ever would. But for the first time, I felt a small flicker of hope, fragile but there. A part of me wanted to try, to see if we could rebuild something out of the wreckage. I'll take it one day at a time, I said finally. That's all I can promise. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. That's all I can ask for. As we stood and began to walk away from the bench, side by side but not quite together, I realized that healing wouldn't be linear. It would be messy, painful, and uncertain. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something new, a path forward, however fragile. And for now, that was enough.